Thank you to Dr. Edwards for the lovely introduction. I want to say a brief word about what I now know of Dr. Edwards' previous boxing career, which is to say that I wanted to be a boxer when I was a kid. And my mom vetoed that idea because she thought that if I got knocked around like that I couldn't later have a prolific and accomplished academic career. So of course, Dr. Edwards stands as, living proof that my mother was incorrect in that assumption. So I'll be happy to tell her that, I'm gonna call her when I get out of here. So, thank you to everybody for being here. I've had a busy semester. As you can see, I have no haircut, which is usually not the case when I make public appearances. Tony had to come get me out of bed this morning. We went to Honest John's. I'm like kind of sort of 50% restored to full functionality. Recently quit smoking, so again, I'm like kind of on low power mode. So I'm gonna get to it, and I'm gonna start talking. So I have a handout. I'm gonna say a few words that situate the handout and explain kind of where I'm going with this, and then we'll do that activity, which doesn't really involve talking if you don't want to talk or anything. You can just look at the handout and think about it. And I'll read a couple facts first. So I have a lot of stuff, preliminary stuff I need to say. Not sure what order to do it in. Okay, Wayne State sits on the land of the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Wyandot peoples, so that's the land acknowledgement. And I kind of want to say something about land acknowledgements also, where it's like, we also got to think about how, like, we all had a lot, not everyone here, because not everyone here is from Michigan, of course, but those of us that had Michigan history, we remember that there was a pretty decent amount of time when I was in 4th grade spent on the history of Michigan's indigenous peoples and what was happening here prior to, European settlement. I don't really think that's enough, which is to say that we probably need to think about the fact that we continue to have indigenous communities here in Michigan. We continue to have indigenous people and indigenous issues. So like the overall colonial project remains ongoing. So we kind of have to think about our own sort of imbrication in that. So I think that the land acknowledgement situation is necessary, but it's insufficient. And beyond that, the next fact I have. Deaths in Michigan prisons spiked in 2018 to the highest rate in at least 25 years. This is for a lot of different reasons: food, healthcare, security, violence, and something we got to think about. Currently in the state of Michigan, 64,000 people are incarcerated, which that's not the highest per capita rate amongst American states or anything like that. Obviously, Florida, California, and Texas all have higher per capita prison populations than we do. But that's something we have to think about also. And the reason that I bring these things up is actually related to the activity we're going to do today, which is to say that we don't always think about political issues as immediately germane to the teaching of composition. And by we, I mean just as a field, and all by field I mean rhetoric and composition studies, but then also more broadly, English studies does not always consider these things in connection with each other, which I think is both it's counterproductive in a couple different ways, but primarily because many of our students are indigenous, right? Are affected by indigenous issues, and then many of our students are clearly our students are not currently incarcerated, but statistically our students are likely to have relatives or friends who are, and then also our students are coming from communities which have been negatively affected by mass incarceration for generations in a way that continues to inform the reality in the world that they live in. And essentially this is where we start from, and that's what we're doing. So, and I think that, a lot of times, holistically, we got to think about the whole student when we're teaching people to write. And we're going to talk about why that is in a second as well. But the reason that I kind of started with these bummer facts is because, if we try to teach writing without considering the bummer facts, we can't really do it, basically. And if we can't do it, then why are we doing it? So then beyond that, those of us that are GTAs, which is not many, GEOC has the general membership meeting in room 144 at Purdy Kresge tomorrow at 6 p.m. So try to make it out to that if you can. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started talking about the stuff. So like it says here, my academic discipline is rhetoric and composition, which means that my work is primarily concerned with writing instruction at the university level. And the thing about that is that my field has a specific set of assumptions and a specific set of research problems. So when you have freshman composition, which Tony, can you get Dominic a copy of the handout real quick? I'm glad that we have a small enough group that I can just address people and it's like not weird, like nobody feels put on the spot because we're kind of already on the spot anyway, So essentially, rhetoric and composition is concerned with how to teach college level reading and writing skills to undergraduate students and what are the various different ways to get there. And a lot of the different paradigms within that academic discipline sort of hinge on how we imagine students. So essentially, freshman composition, which is that one writing class that everybody has to take when they go to college, here at Wayne State it's called English 1020, right? The idea is that a student will emerge from English 1020 with a certain set of literacy skills which will then be appropriate for the rest of their college level coursework. And so that's the idea behind that class, right? And that comes out in the late 19th century at Harvard. And the idea is that if we can get people all on the same page, then they can all complete college level coursework, right? And then in the middle of the 20th century, we see the American university system become increasingly accessible to women and people of color and immigrants and people from like a more working class background, et cetera. And these new students have different literacies and they're coming from public high school systems that don't have the same resources. And for what various different reasons, they are deemed to be even below, and note the scare quotes here, the reading and writing levels, right, that we would associate with college freshmen. So out of that problem, we see the development of a set of curriculums known as basic writing, which is an additional class, right, that students now take before they take freshman composition. And what we might recall, and if I have the facts wrong about this, then somebody could tell me either now or later when I solicit questions, but the way that I understand it is that the purpose of first year composition is itself remedial to begin with, which carries a certain set of assumptions. And then basic writing has an additionally remedial purpose. So essentially, basic writing is like an enhanced version of first year composition. So we have basic writing here at Wayne State. It's called English 1010, which is a course that I teach among other courses. And a lot of my research is concerned with not necessarily the question of what should happen at the programmatic level with regard to university writing curriculums, because to be quite frank, I perceive that question as being above my pay grade. So essentially what that means is I don't get paid to sit around and think about what should happen at the administrative level. So it seems most productive for me to focus in on what is actually happening either in my classroom, in my instructional design, in my interactions with my students and with my colleagues. So it's the sort of thing where I think we've all had a job where, there's that one person who is like a fry cook. I used to be a fry cook. Or, the security guard, which I also used to be or whatever, who is not a particularly good fry cook or a particularly good security guard, but they have a lot of opinions about what should be happening in the organization on the systemic level, but they can't really focus on making the fries, right? That was me at all my previous jobs, so I'm trying not to repeat that mistake. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't necessarily have a comment on whether or not basic writing should continue to exist or whether freshman composition should continue to exist so much as I'm concerned with the assumption that those things will continue to exist and form the conditions of possibility for the intellectual work of, you know, rhetoric and composition instructors like myself. So that's where we started from. So that's where we're at with that. So basically, the thing about those of us that are composition instructors, and then also people who do other kinds of teaching, is we sort of end up with a very basic problem wherein we find ourselves attempting to teach skills and content which we ourselves did not learn in classrooms. And what I mean by that is, so a couple facts about me. I dropped out of school in 8th grade, and I kind of half-assed went back to high school for a minute and sort of graduated, and I tested out of some classes and stuff. And so basically the majority of the literacy education that I've received was either, you know, sort of at home, just being around, reading and writing, or also just, you know, being not in school, kind of left to my own devices and spending a lot of time in the library or on the internet, just kind of reading or writing or whatever as something to do. And that's where I developed the literacy skills that I currently possess, is that way. I was not a good student. You know, I spent a lot of time in middle school in various, like I was in the emotionally impaired class, you know, like I was in ISS a lot, stuff like that. So I was not a good student. I was not a good student in undergrad. I was an undergrad for 6 years. I graduated with a 2.1 grade point average. So I can't really teach my students about time management or being a good student or, you know, like making a plan or an organization, all this other stuff, because those aren't skills that I possess. So it's bad faith for me to attempt to impart that. So basically, this is a very long way of describing how I myself arrived at the point where I was at when I began to do some of the research and think about some of the ideas that we're going to discuss today. So essentially, when I think about how it is that I came to read and write, it is via my engagement with two different fields, which is radical politics and the arts, right? So via my interest in those two things from like my early teens and onward, I spent a lot of time reading and writing and thinking about them. And that's where I learned how to make arguments and how to do research and how to situate myself within larger conversations and how to make sense of my own experience and how to think about my own identity relative to other people or whatever. It's via that. I didn't learn how to make a thesis statement because someone in class told me I had to. I learned how to do that because I learned that there is a certain utility to it. And so, long story short, when I started teaching here at Wayne State, I found that one thing, a major difference that I had from my students was that they had a negative association with print literacy. And by print literacy, I refer to reading and writing. And not even like the Twitter or Facebook or whatever. I mean like books, journal articles, whatever. They perceived it as negative, and then also something that wasn't for them or something that they did not associate with their own self-concept, right? So they think to themselves, I am not a person who can or should do this, right? And so I thought to myself, okay, like, I can sit down and give them 1 million sentence level writing drills until the end of time, but if they emotionally and affectively do not regard themselves as a person who can possess these skills, then regardless of their aptitude or their ability, they're just not going to be able to do it. And the reason for that is because there's any number of things in my life that I now know that I can do, but did not think I could do for a very long time. And So, one thing that I had always wanted to be involved in since I was a teenager was art, art theory, art criticism, things of that nature. And I always felt like I was excluded from that by virtue of being a certain kind of person. And because I was a certain kind of person, that's not something that I could be a part of just because of my various like identity categories or the way I talk or the way I dress or the way I act or whatever. So I thought to myself, okay, well, the way that I can begin to understand like how my students feel about print literacy is if I put myself in a position where I try to do something or be involved with something that I perceive myself as being excluded from. And if I can put myself in that same position of learning and vulnerability and being open to new ideas and concepts, then I can empathize with my students in a way that I maybe wouldn't be able to otherwise. I also quit smoking for the same reason, where I was just like, okay, like this is something that I've relied on for a very long time to kind of punctuate my life. So if I remove it, I'm gonna put myself in a situation where I'm like, sort of, without something that makes sense to me. And then I can kind of sort of begin to feel how my students feel, right? So essentially, that's where I started from, is via my own engagement with art and trying to make sense of it in a way that I feel like I've been excluded from it, I can start to make sense of how my students understand their own relationship with print literacy. So a couple years ago in a class, I was assigned a book by Ralph Cintron called Angel's Town, which is basically about the way that people in an industrial city in the Midwest, in a predominantly Latinx community, sort of, try to get out of this hoodie, it's a little warm in here. And, I got a bleach stain on this shirt, so hopefully now that I called attention to it, people won't just sit there and focus on it. So basically the book was about how people made sense of their reality, specifically rhetorically, without print literacy. So people in this community, for various reasons, do not have access to print literacy, but they make sense of their world in other ways, right? So, cars, clothes, food, social relationships, things of that nature. And so essentially, I started thinking about that. There was a particular chapter in which Ralph Cintron is spending time with a younger kid named Valerio who's been labeled learning disabled, right? And as a consequence of being labeled learning disabled, he's a couple years behind in school and he gets put in different classes and things of that nature. Now, we know now in 2019 that a lot of times removing students from the mainstream classroom instead of giving them, embedded support within the classroom is not always a best practice. We understand this now, but obviously in the 90s it was a different conversation. And so Valerio feels as if he cannot read or write in the book, but then he has this wall where he does all these paintings of cars, and it's clear that he has the ability to organize complex information in an extremely sophisticated and dynamic way, just not with like words, not with writing. So I think to myself, okay, like, how is it that I can take the lesson from this chapter and combine it with what I'm thinking about and the goal that I have for my students, specifically basic writing students? So what I got to was, I'm gonna do two things. One, instead of giving them pieces of writing to write about out the gate initially, I'm going to give them pieces of art, right? And I'm gonna put the art on the board and say, write what you think about this for 15 minutes, and then we'll see what we come up with. Now, the idea here is twofold, right? One, that teaching basic writing, most of my students in this case currently are of color, many of which are from the city, and art is happening here in Detroit around them sometimes even in their own neighborhood, but they're not aware of it. And so a good example of this is now that real estate in Midtown and downtown has become extremely expensive, people are starting to build galleries and autonomous art spaces in Southwest Detroit, where many of my students live, right? Now, I'm not knocking these people, right? Like, because a lot of the people that have those galleries are my friends and collaborators, right? So I'm not trying to talk spicy about them. Like, you know, we're all caught up in the mix. You put the building where you can afford to put the building. But on a structural, systemic level, what's interesting to me is I'll have these instances where I'll talk to my students and I'll be like, okay, you know the corner of like Verner and 24th Street, there's the taco truck there. And they're like, yeah, by the laundromat. And I'm like, okay, then there's the art gallery in the parking lot. And they're like, what? So how is it that they have art galleries in their neighborhood that they don't know about? And, you know, and I'm at the art gallery, I'm at some after hours party, right? And I stumble out and there's my students, you know, like going to the laundromat or whatever, and I'm there with my hair done or whatever. And so I start to think to myself, like, okay, like something's wrong here. So if I can show my students that they have access to the arts and commenting on art and making critical judgments about it, that empowers them to begin to make critical judgments about other things. That's my logic, at least. That's what I was thinking. So I give them that, and then also with a couple different assignments, instead of just having them write 5-paragraph essays, I have them select 5 images that represent different concepts, and then write a paragraph explaining why they selected that image as opposed to just having to write a paragraph. So essentially, by engaging with the ability to communicate visually and put ideas forward visually, they then feel a bit more empowered to communicate ideas, and then that can get them, you know, writing, right? Because basically the thing about writing is you really have to trick yourself into it. At least I do. Because if I sit down and I'm like, okay, I'm going to write this article about, you know, prison abolition and the library system, for example, and I try to just sit down and do it, I'm never going to do it. I'm going to check Facebook and then play video games. I'm going to call Tony and, you know, like ask him his opinion about this one episode of Seinfeld, or I'm going to do something stupid and distract myself. Whereas if I find some way to trick myself into it, you know, I can go ahead and get it done. So basically, my idea is that by giving my students access to the arts and giving them a piece and having them write about it, I can get them thinking in a different way, in a way that will eventually kind of lead them to feeling empowered to read and write at the university level and participate in society in the ways that entails. Now, whether or not different students really need to be given different literacy skills, you know, is a different conversation that we can have a different day. Maybe that'll be what I come in here and talk about next year. But that is my job, is to bring a certain set of students to a certain set of university level literacy skills. So basically the handout that I passed out that we're going to look at now is the way that I'm thinking that I'm going to start to accomplish that. So if you flip to the second page, we have Kazimir Malevich, probably said that wrong. So bit of context about this artist, which is the first and last time I'm going to do this today. I don't know what movement in Russia we associate his art with. I did a couple years ago, but I've since forgot it because I'm not a historian anymore. But basically, he was doing some avant-garde art in the early Soviet Russia, and he had a flourishing career under Lenin. But then when the situation changed in the more Stalinist direction, then the Soviet government had a slightly more Philistinic attitude about different forms of art and cultural production. They only wanted to have socialist realism. They didn't want to do, like, you know, interesting stuff anymore. So now that I've thoroughly ruined anybody's ability to have like a sort of pure aesthetic experience of this piece, let's go ahead and write about it on the next page for 5 minutes. All right, let's go 3 more minutes. All right, cool. Typically, I make my students, I invite my students to write for 15 minutes. So you all got off easy today. And what we're gonna do now is we're just gonna do questions, comments, ideas now, because we got about 20 minutes left. Apparently I talked for a little longer than I thought I was going to. I must have had a lot to say. So we'll talk about the piece and the activity and the idea and what I said now for the remaining 20 minutes. And because that way everybody can have opportunity to contribute and participate or whatever. If anybody has questions about assessment or learning outcomes, we can go ahead and do that first to get that out of the way. Otherwise, what do we think? We can take a minute to think about it, I guess.
I felt sort of challenged by the prompt, which was just write what you think about the picture on the next page. Do you give more like kind of clear direction? Do students resist the just sort of open-endedness of the task? How does that scene play out, and how do you facilitate it?
No and yes. No, I do. So that's an excellent question. I'm glad we started there. I don't give any more, I do not give any more direction than that, And the reason that I don't do that is because I don't recall anybody giving me any kind of direction about that kind of stuff, right? And so from my own subject position, having left school at 8th grade and just kind of being 12 years old, out of the house, in the library by myself while my parents are at work, right? And this is not a Horatio Alger story. I'm just explaining the situation in which I come to develop my own reading and writing. I was just kind of out in the world just looking at stuff, and stuff was happening and I was figuring it out. And I feel like that was actually of benefit to me as opposed to my detriment, because I'm pretty happy with where that led me to. So I don't do that. And the reason I don't do that is because I feel like me being afforded the opportunity to go be like unschooled, those of you that are in education know what that means, was a blessing for me and a privilege. So I want to impart that to my students to the best of my ability. And yeah.
So just to add on to what you were saying, would you think the lack of context in the question created for a more developing mindset to the others that are viewing it?
How exactly do you mean developing?
To a more creative mindset, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, more creative.
Yeah, I think so. And I think so with an important caveat, which is the second part of Tony's question. And I'm glad that you added to what Tony is saying, because that kind of all helps it make sense to me, is students do resist that initially. Students initially are like, why are you doing this to me? Like, why do I have to come up with come up with my own take? And it's not their fault, right? It's not like students are jerks and they hate my activity or whatever. It's more so, here at Wayne State, the majority of our students are coming from public school systems that, and it's not the public school teachers or administrators' fault either. A lot of it has to do with No Child Left Behind, where students are taught to the test for 18 years and everything is just checking boxes. And then as soon as they come to a point where they are expected to make their own critical judgments about anything in a way that doesn't have like a really clear framework, it's terrifying, because that hasn't been their experience of education. And I'll tell all of you a brief anecdote and then I'll shut up, I promise. I took a few standardized tests of my own when I was in middle school, and I got into Cranbrook, right? Based on the test that I took. And I didn't end up going because my parents had no money, but when I got up there, I'm sitting in an 8th grade class with 6 other 8th graders, which is astounding to me because any class that I had been in public school prior had been like overcrowded, right? And they're like, okay, children, we read the Iliad. What do you think about it? And I'm sitting there like, why are a bunch of 8th graders being asked what they think about anything? And now looking back on it, I realized that the purpose of that is because the assumption is that these 8th graders at Cranbrook are gonna be elites. They're gonna be like a senator, or they're gonna be, like Mark Zuckerberg's lawyer, or they're gonna be the president of a country or whatever. So the idea is that the reason that students in certain kinds of institutions are not taught to think critically and autonomously at any point is because like there's social and political consequences to that, is what I mean to suggest. So the reason that they resisted at first is the same reason that, I would resist it if people, when I go into a hotel for a conference, I walk up there to check in and they say, oh, good afternoon, Mr. Luckin. And I'm like, I don't know who that is, right? I don't know who Mr. Luckin is. Because usually when I'm in hotels, people are calling me buddy, because I used to work at hotels for 6 years, right? So to answer both of your questions, yes and yes, it does lead to a more development-oriented, creative mindset for the students, I think, and hope. But they are also initially resistant to it because I think it's different from their experience.
So what's the after this look like? Let's say we have an image,
Yeah.
the students write whatever they think, and I not to like prescribe 2 options to choose from, but when I was thinking about it, the 2 options seem to either try to make this effort to sort of square the circle and say, okay, Robbie's got something like this and Jamal has something like that, and they're super different. How do we both understand them as responses to this?
Yeah.
Or to sort of like let it splinter and sort of let the class follow in these sort of different directions for different students.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, or both, I guess. Yes could just be the answer.
Well, so the answer is yes.
Okay.
That both of those things could happen, and I'd be happy with both of them. But also this activity has 2 purposes. One of which is connected to the larger project of giving students access to the arts as a way of enhancing their literacy skills and empowering them, but also that it is a transition between being in class and being Well, between not being in class and then being in class.
Okay.
Which is to say that, so I read some Fred Moten one time, which is going to shock everybody that I would ever do that. And he was saying that he gets nervous when he goes in to teach. And then it's like the students are in there and they're hanging out and they're looking at their phone and they might be doing some dance or whatever. And I have to come in and put a little bass in my voice and say, all right, class, we're going to have class now. And it's like in that moment, I'm basically, being a cop. And I don't want to be a cop. Because if I wanted to be a cop, I would have went to cop school. So essentially, this exercise is a way for students to get oriented towards the process of learning in a way that they're in control of. And then when we get done with it, we either talk about the art, which I can talk about an example of that. Okay, so anybody who's in the room who I've assigned their art to my students before and they're okay with me talking about what happened, raise your hand. All right, good deal. So I won't do that then. But basically, sometimes they have a lot to say about the piece that I assigned, and I think to myself, like, okay, all right, like, if they want to talk about it, we're going to talk about it, right? So they might be like, I don't know what this is, or like, like, okay, why is that guy red and that guy's green? Or, like, why is that person on the bridge screaming? What are they so upset about? Or, like, whatever. And if they have something to say about it, then we're going to talk about it. But if they don't, then we're going to talk about thesis statements or whatever. But regardless of anything, it's my feeling that the process of engaging with the art on the projector for 15 minutes has them oriented towards, being in class and concentrating or whatever. Because I don't want to try to force them into that, but at the same time, it's like we are here to do something important. And they might not necessarily have the emotional skill set to like be in class and concentrate and do stuff, which I still kind of don't have, and I'm in grad school, So that would be the answer to that question. And then we had a question here.
Yeah, what I was wondering is, is this an activity that you do throughout the semester, and how do you feel that, because we all like our comfort zones, and frankly our brains are lazy, we like to do what we're used to, and then it's easier and we're good at it, and so we stop. So how do you use this? Do you use this in any way to push students' boundaries of comfort in writing? Do you like build? How do you build on this to continually get them pushed forward in building those skill sets?
Yes, that is another great question. So to illustrate that, if we could just turn to the next page in the handout, right? I'll give you an example of how I at least attempt to do this, right? Okay, so some of you may be familiar with what this picture is and may have seen this before, right? And so this could be like some sort of conceptual photograph that has something very important to say about like service sector workers and like, a post-industrial austerity society. It could be that. But does anybody know what it actually is? Yes.
A picture of you clowning around at your job.
Yes, this is a picture of me trying to be cool at my job when I was 24, right? But a person who hasn't seen this before, because it's not, you kind of got to really look at it, especially with it being a little grainy to know that it's me, right? But, that could be that, right? So when I give my students something like this, for example, and I say, okay, this is some art, right? They'll write about it and they'll be like, okay, the person that took this picture wanted to say this and this and this and this and this, right? Or if I give them like I just take a picture of a stop sign and then like do something crazy with it in Instagram and then post it and say that it's from the MoMA, right? The students don't know.
Yep.
And so they're gonna write like, this artist wants people to stop climate change, right? Or whatever. And then at the end, if I say like, yeah, that was just a picture of a stop sign that I took, right? They usually get mad, right? And they feel as if I played some kind of trick on them and that I was like playing with them or like messing with them or whatever. And then what I say at that point is like, no, the point of this is we decide what is or isn't art, or what has like certain purposes or certain messages or certain reasons for their own existence socially based on our experiences and our education. So if I take the Mona Lisa off the wall and I like put it in my trunk and I pull up to your house to like get your microwave to go get it fixed or whatever, and you see a Mona Lisa painting in my trunk, you're not gonna think the Mona Lisa from the Louvre is in Walt's trunk, right? You're gonna think he has a print of the Mona Lisa in his trunk for some weird reason, right? So basically, by changing the format of the exercise and sort of renegotiating and unsettling those different boundaries, my idea is that if I can kind of push the students a little further in their understanding of these questions, I can get them to like think about the big picture in a way where they're kind of seeing things in a different frame, I guess, would be how I would respond to that.
So I mean, I think that's interesting given the way that you use this prompt as like a transition between the outside and the class space.
Yeah.
Right, which is that basically what you're saying, though better than this, is context is everything, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to art, or really, since this is a comp class, when it comes to any sort of like writing or text or rhetoric, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the same words. I mean, the famous example is always like run in a movie theater is different than somewhere else, right? What have you.
Yeah.
So, or these days run, I guess, has connotations in a lot of places. Point being is that like this image made into a projection on a screen becomes very different than if they were to engage with this in the world. Right?
Like on my Facebook.
Or like if they saw you clowning around at work.
Yeah.
Trying to look cool next to a car.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So I wonder how much that, how do I ask this? Is part of your aim to bring them objects they could, or visual objects they could possibly see or engage with out in the world, bring them into the classroom space, and thusly allow the things they engage with in the world to have the same kind of impact that things they engage with in class do?
Yes, absolutely, yes. And another example of that is, so I have a couple, friends and collaborators who make art from vernacular objects or actions in the world. And so I can show them something like that and say like, okay, this is a piece of art, and they're like, no, that's a this or a that, and I'm like, yeah, well, that was in a museum, dog, so like it can be both. Does that make sense? And then with context specifically, I want to kind of talk about another couple examples that I give, which is that so those of you that are familiar with the Carol Walker controversy at the DIA, which that was what, like 10 years ago? That was a minute, right? So Carol Walker is a black artist who has made a lot of work in which she repurposes what we would consider to be stereotypical depictions of African Americans in order to make some sort of larger aesthetic point, right? Or, there are other examples of this with artists that have done this, right? And so there was a controversy at the DIA wherein a security guard who worked at the DIA, I want to say it was a security guard, felt that the image was offensive and racist and made a complaint to the museum's board. They weren't trying to hear it, and essentially, the museum of the DIA workers got involved, and eventually it was removed, right? Now, obviously 9 out of 10 people who are artists or otherwise art-oriented, not 9 out of 10, but many people were like, oh, well, the arts is more important than an individual person's feelings, right? Now, me personally, I'm inclined to side with the security guard in this matter. But at the same time, right, the context is important, where, hypothetically, the idea is that if we take an object or an image that we would otherwise find to be offensive, but put it in a museum, it has to not be offensive because of like what we call like the autonomy of art, right? And the reason that's an important teachable moment is because like I think students need to be shown that the idea of the autonomy of art, like art being a distinct sphere of cultural production which is protected and has specific boundaries, is like itself sort of culturally constructed, right? So, you know, for example, like, this is kind of a cheap shot joke, but like, there's a lot of people that would get really, really, really upset about an art piece that depicted simulated animal cruelty, much more so than if it was like a repurposing of racist images, right? You know, so, and when I ask my 1010 students why that is, like, they're very quick to correctly identify what demographics of people would be like more likely to have that response, which is a lot of fun for me. So basically my point is that there are, by kind of changing and renegotiating a lot of these different boundaries around different kinds of texts and context and forms of rhetorical and cultural production, I think we can have a lot of different really helpful teachable moments with students about like how it is that they get meaning from the world and also then produce meaning, which is ultimately what we're trying to show them how to do, is produce texts that mean to other people what they want them to mean. Like that's how we have rhetorical agency, right? Is when what I attempt to communicate to Tony in a text, he gets from it. That's what rhetorical agency is, I guess, to me. So we do have about 5 minutes left. I want to make sure that everybody gets their questions or comments in, so, yeah.
Kind of going back to the beginning, when you were talking about you dropping out of the 8th grade and coming back to high school with careless intentions to pass. What drove you to educate yourself after high school?
Well, okay, so after college, after high school, I did go to college. I went to community college for 1.5 years, and then I went to university after that. But to answer your question, it was a combination of things where, one, I wanted to learn stuff, right? Kind of, you know, but then also, just within my family, my dad was a carpenter when I was born, and he had a pallet fall on his wrist and bust his wrist, right? So as a result, he really kind of pushed me to be educated and have like an education so I could have like a professional career and not have to depend on my body to like work like he did, because like the thing about being in the skilled trades is like if you have some sort of catastrophic injury, it can end your career. And then also beyond that, there's a lot of different like physical ailments that come with that, and like, you know, so it was a combination of wanting to learn, but then also just like my family pushing me to have that value of like becoming educated and successful, I guess.
Would you feel if your family or your peers weren't there to guide you to success, would you have gone the same path?
My family, no. Definitely not. And then to answer the compound question, most of my peers from that part of my life do not have university educations, I guess, would be what I would say. Like everybody I grew up with, I think I'm one of 2 people that has a bachelor's degree, and then out of everybody that I grew up with, I'm the only person that has an advanced degree. Yeah.
So after like all of these assignments, what do you, is there any kind of like object or thing that everything like accumulates into or like builds towards?
Yeah.
Kind of, you guys touched on that a little bit, but where
Yeah.
does like the progression of things go towards the end of the semester when you're teaching?
So you mean within the course, within the semester?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's an excellent question. I'm glad you brought that up. Specifically in this case, what's going to happen is this semester, and then hopefully for every semester that I'm at Wayne State previously, we're going to have, the students are going to have a guided tour of the undergraduate library, which is going to be led by Daniel Sperry from the art collection. And he's going to show them all the different art with a brief sort of introduction and context for it. And then they're going to write a 4-page essay in which they analyze a specific piece of art from the library and write about it and say what they think it means and what they think is going on and in context or whatever. So basically the 1010 curriculum at Wayne State already has like a visual analysis paper where like they'll analyze like a music video or like a statue or whatever. So basically what I'm doing is just a slightly enhanced version of that, wherein Daniel and I are going to show them all the different paintings and pieces in the UGL, and then they're going to write a 4-page paper about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And yeah, because you know the thing specifically with that is I see the students in the library a lot already. They're already in there studying and stuff, and there's a lot of art in the library here. There's a lot of art on campus, and it's like you always walk past it. At least I do. I always walk past it, and I'm just like, oh yeah, it's just some stuff, right? So my students are up there in the library, and they're sitting behind like a Jim Shaw painting that's a huge deal, and they don't know. So the pedagogical purpose of this assignment is not only to give them some cool art to look at, and then we get to hang out with Daniel and listen to what Daniel has to say about it, but also that they can see that there's a lot of different things within their own environment that they can make critical judgments and assessments of that they would usually just walk past. You know, so then I think that they can start to begin to think about like larger social stuff or you know, their own subjectivity or whatever that way. So we're coming up on 1:30. If anybody has any closing questions or comments, I'm available for that. Other than that, okay, cool. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. This was a lot of fun for me. And I'm going to be around campus, and I'm going to get some coffee now. And if anybody has other stuff they want to talk about, my email is on the handout if people want to email me. And thank you for being here.